I've been asked more than once what I said when I finally walked into that dining room and saw my daughter sitting there like nothing was wrong. People want the dramatic version. They want me to have thrown a chair, called her names, made a scene the neighbors would talk about for years. I didn't do any of that. What I did instead took me 11 hours, and by the time the sun came up, my daughter's entire comfortable life had quietly come apart at the seams, piece by piece, and I don't regret a second of it. But I need to start from the beginning, because if I don't, you're going to think I'm a cruel man, and I promise you, I am not. My name is Robert Callahan. I'm 66 years old. I spent 31 years running an HVAC supply business out of a warehouse in Dayton, Ohio, and I built it from a single delivery truck into something that eventually paid for 3 college educations and a house that's been paid off for a decade now. My wife Ruth passed 6 years ago. Cancer. Duh. Fast. Cruel. Over before we'd even finished being angry about it. Since then, it's just been me and my daughter Melissa and my son-in-law Craig and my 2 grandkids, who live about 40 minutes away in a subdivision Craig's family helped them get into. Melissa is 32. She's my only daughter, my youngest child, and if I'm honest with you, the one I probably spoiled the most. Because she was the baby, and because after her mother got sick, I think I overcompensated in ways I'm only now starting to understand. She married Craig 4 years ago. Nice enough young man on paper. Good job in insurance sales. Firm handshake. But his mother, Diane, is a different story entirely. The first time I met Diane Whitfield, she looked around my house like she was pricing it for a listing, and something in the back of my skull said, "This woman is going to be a problem someday." I ignored that feeling because you do, when your daughter's happy and the wedding's already paid for. Now, 3 weeks ago, I flew down to Charlotte for a trade show. Every year, same show, same hotel, same routine. I go, I work the floor, I fly home, Sunday night. Ruth used to come with me for the first few years before she got sick, and I still go out of habit more than necessity at this point in my career. Melissa knew I was going. Craig knew. The whole family knew, same as every year. What nobody knew, because I didn't tell a soul, was that the trade show got cut short. A pipe burst in the convention center Friday night, flooded half the exhibit hall, and by Saturday morning the whole thing was canceled. I could have stayed in Charlotte, gotten a nice dinner, maybe caught a ball game. Instead, I booked a flight home that same afternoon. I didn't call ahead, didn't text anybody. 20-some years of being a father who shows up when you least expect him, and I still get a kick out of walking through my own front door and surprising somebody with a hug. I landed a little after 2 in the afternoon, grabbed my bag off the carousel, and drove myself home. It was a Thursday, which matters, because Thursdays are the day Melissa usually brings the grandkids by after school, since my house is closer to their school than hers is. That's routine. Nothing unusual about her car being in my driveway on a Thursday. What was unusual, what I noticed the second I turned onto my own street, was Diane Whitfield's white Cadillac parked behind Melissa's minivan. Diane doesn't come to my house. In 4 years of marriage, I could count on one hand the number of times Diane Whitfield had set foot inside my home, and every single one of those times had a reason attached to it, usually a holiday, usually with advance notice. There was no holiday today. There was no reason I could think of for Diane to be sitting in my driveway on a random Thursday afternoon. I felt something tighten in my chest, that thing you feel when your gut knows before your brain's caught up. I told myself I was being an old man about it. Maybe Craig had the day off. Maybe they were planning a surprise for somebody's birthday. People visit. It happens. I parked at the curb, grabbed my bag, and walked up toward my own front door, and that's when I noticed the house sounded wrong. Not wrong in a scary way, at first. Wrong in a layered way, like 2 separate rooms were living 2 separate lives under the same roof. From the direction of my kitchen, I could hear voices. Relaxed voices. Ice clinking in glasses. Somebody laughing, that easy laugh people do when they've got nowhere else to be. And from the den, off to the left, nothing. Not silence exactly. Something under the silence. A small sound I couldn't place at first. I pushed the door open, and I saw my grandson. Tyler is 7 years old. My oldest grandchild. He was sitting on the floor of the den, alone, knees pulled up to his chest, and he was crying. The kind of quiet, crying kids do when they've been told to be quiet, and they're trying so hard to obey that it comes out worse. His inhaler was on the carpet next to him, empty, the canister rattling when I picked it up later. His lips had a grayish tinge to them I will see in my nightmares for the rest of my life. He was wheezing, that high thin whistle sound, gasping for air in his own grandfather's den while, 20 feet away, through a doorway, 4 grown adults sat around my kitchen table drinking sweet tea like it was any other Thursday. I have seen that boy laugh so hard he fell off a swing set. I have seen him cry over a broken toy, over a skinned knee, over losing at checkers. I have never in his 7 years of life seen him look at me the way he looked at me in that doorway, like he'd been waiting, like some small part of him had been holding on, hoping somebody, anybody, would walk through that door and finally do something. I did not panic. I want to be clear about that, because panic is not useful and I am not built for it. I dropped my bag, crossed that den in about 3 steps, scooped him up, and I was already moving toward the kitchen, already shouting for somebody to call 911, when I realized the voices in the kitchen hadn't even paused. They were still laughing. My grandson was turning gray in my arms, and the adults responsible for him were still laughing. I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to sit with it, because it took me a long moment to even process what I was looking at. I got Tyler into the car myself, because I wasn't waiting for an ambulance that might take 10 minutes when the children's hospital was 11 away, and I drove faster than I have driven in 20 years, with my 7-year-old grandson wheezing in the back seat, one hand reaching back to hold his ankle the whole way, because it was the only part of him I could reach, and I needed to be touching him, needed him to know I was there. We made it. 4 minutes after we walked through those emergency room doors, a nurse had a nebulizer mask on his face and was telling me, in that calm, clinical voice medical people use when they don't want you to panic, that his oxygen saturation had been at 81%. Anything under 90 is considered an emergency. 81 is the kind of number that becomes a different kind of night if you wait 10 more minutes. Mr. Callahan, the young doctor said to me, maybe 35, name tag said Osei, has anyone told you how long he might have been struggling before you found him? I said I didn't know. Based on his presentation, he said, still gentle, still clinical, considerably longer than a few minutes. This kind of respiratory distress builds. Somebody should have recognized it and acted well before this point. I held Tyler's small hand while they worked, and he squeezed my fingers, weak, but he squeezed them. I squeezed back, twice, the way I used to do with his mother when she was small and scared of thunderstorms. And I felt something in my chest go very, very still. Not hot anymore. Cold. The kind of cold that doesn't come back up for a long, long time. I called Melissa from the hospital hallway. She picked up on the second ring, still laughing at something. I could hear it in her voice before she even said hello. And I told her where I was and why, and I listened to her go completely silent on the other end of the line. If you're the kind of person who's been in a room like that one, the kind of room where you find out somebody you love was hurting while the people who should have noticed didn't, do us a favor and drop a word in the comments about where you're watching this from tonight. It helps more than you'd think, and I read every single one. They got there 40 minutes later, Melissa first, Craig behind her, and Diane trailing in last of all, still holding her purse like she was at a luncheon. Melissa went straight to Tyler's bedside, and I will say this for her, whatever else happened that day, her fear for her son was real. I could see it shaking through her whole body. But I wasn't ready to talk to her yet. I stood up, and I walked out into the hallway, and I found a quiet corner, and I called my attorney's after-hours line, because Bill Hutchins has known me for 22 years, and he answers when I call no matter what time it is, and I told him I needed to talk first thing in the morning about some paperwork. Then I went back inside, and I sat with my grandson until his color came back, and his breathing evened out, and the doctor said the word stable, and only then did I finally let Melissa tell me what happened. Now, here's the part I need you to really pay attention to, because this is where the whole afternoon rearranged itself in my head. Diane had shown up unannounced around noon, Melissa said, not for a visit but with a folder of paperwork. Diane's husband had passed 2 years ago and left behind a lake property up in Michigan that had been in his family for 3 generations. And apparently there'd been some complicated language in the will about it eventually passing to the next generation. And Diane had convinced herself, or convinced Craig, or some combination of both, that this meant it should be signed over now, immediately, into a trust that named Craig as sole trustee, cutting out Craig's two siblings entirely, before anybody could contest it. She needed Craig's signature on documents that afternoon, she said, because her attorney had some kind of filing deadline, and she'd driven from 2 states away to get it done in person. But here's the detail that mattered. Melissa's own name wasn't going to be on any of it. Diane had structured the whole thing so the property, and eventually the money from it when they sold it, which they were already planning to do, would belong to Craig alone, separate property, nothing Melissa would have any legal claim to if anything ever happened to the marriage. My daughter had been about to witness her mother-in-law maneuver her own husband into freezing her out of an inheritance, in my house, at my kitchen table, while her son sat forgotten in the next room. Tyler, Melissa admitted, her voice breaking now, had complained about his chest feeling tight almost as soon as they'd arrived, more than an hour before I walked in. He has exercise-induced asthma, well managed usually, but he'd had a cold that week and his inhaler was low. Melissa had told him to go lie down in the den, thought he was being dramatic the way 7-year-olds sometimes are, and had gone back to the argument at the table because Diane and Craig were locked in a tense back and forth about the paperwork, and Melissa, in her own words, didn't want to leave the room while decisions were being made about my own future. "You left your son alone for over an hour," I said, struggling to breathe, "while you argued about a lake house." "I didn't know it was that serious, Dad," she said. "I checked on him twice." "You checked on him?" I repeated. "And you went back to the table both times?" She didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. "I want to tell you something about myself before I walk you through the rest of that night, because I need you to understand I'm not a man who acts in anger. I don't make decisions I'll regret later, and I don't do things in the heat of the moment that I'll have to walk back the next morning. Every single thing I did after that hospital hallway, I had already decided sitting in that plastic chair, watching my grandson breathe through a mask, listening to my daughter explain how a lake house mattered more than a wheezing child. By the time we got Tyler discharged around midnight and I drove myself home to an empty house, I wasn't angry anymore. I was decided, and there's a real difference between the two. I didn't sleep that night. I went into my study, sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and I went to work. The first call, and yes, it was after 1 in the morning, was to my bank. When you've held accounts as long as I have, and you're the primary on everything, there's a number on the back of the card that doesn't care what time it is. I'd used that number twice in 30 years. This made 3. Craig had been added as an authorized user on my supplemental credit card 6 years ago, back when he and Melissa were first married and struggling, a temporary arrangement that had quietly become permanent the way these things do. Groceries, gas, a home theater system he'd told me was half off, a trip to Cancun that mysteriously appeared as a business conference. Removed. 4 minutes on the phone. Done. I moved to the next item. Craig and Melissa's auto insurance had been bundled onto my policy for years, a savings I'd told myself, family helping family. Split off before 3 in the morning. The house was the bigger piece. 2 years ago, when they'd upgraded to their current place, the one in the good school district that Craig's family had been so proud to help them get into, the mortgage company had wanted a cosigner because of some rocky years in Craig's credit history nobody talked about. I was that cosigner. I called my own mortgage broker at 7 sharp, a woman named Patricia I'd worked with for 15 years, and told her I needed to begin the process of removing myself from that obligation, whatever that required on my end. "Everything all right, Robert?" she asked. "It's being handled," I told her. "Thank you for asking." Then there was the college fund. Every month since Tyler was born, quietly, without announcement, I had been putting $400 into a $529 account for him, and another for his little sister Grace, who's 4. Nobody had asked me to. It had just become part of the architecture of things, the way a father who built a business from a delivery truck tries to make sure his grandkids never have to worry the way he did. I did not touch those accounts. I want to be very clear about that, because I need you to understand the difference between punishing my grandchildren and holding their parents accountable. Those funds stayed exactly where they were, untouched, growing, theirs no matter what came next. What I did cancel was the automatic transfer I'd set up into Melissa and Craig's joint household account, the one that quietly covered whatever gap showed up most months: mortgage overflow, a car repair, a vacation that was a little more than they could really afford. Cancelled. Permanently. Not paused. I sat back in my chair for a long moment after that one, because that transfer represented something bigger than the dollar amount. It represented a version of my daughter's household I'd been financing without ever saying so out loud, a comfort level that maybe, possibly, had allowed decisions to get made in that kitchen yesterday afternoon, that a family without a safety net would never have risked making. Not anymore. Then came the calls I won't apologize for. 20 years in this business. You build relationships. You make introductions. You spend favors on the people you love. Craig had gotten his current sales position 2 years ago, partly because I'd made a call to an old customer of mine who runs an insurance agency in Columbus. I'd vouched for him. I made another call, early that morning, to that same man, a decent guy named Terry I've known since our kids were in Little League together, and I told him honestly and without drama that I could no longer personally vouch for Craig going forward, and that whatever consideration had been extended because of my name should be considered concluded. Terry didn't ask for details, just said he understood and hoped everything was okay. That's what 3 decades of keeping your word gets you. People who trust that if Robert Callahan is making a call like that, he's got his reasons. By 5 in the morning, the streaming subscriptions I'd been quietly paying for on their behalf were canceled. The family phone plan I'd been subsidizing was split back into its own separate account, and I'd left a voicemail for Bill Hutchins asking him to draft new paperwork first thing Monday, formalizing that the 529 accounts for Tyler and Grace would now be held in an irrevocable trust, naming me as sole trustee until each child turned 25, completely outside the reach of anyone else, including their own parents, if it ever came to that. I made myself coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the sky turn from black to that pale gray that means the world's about to wake up whether you're ready or not. And I thought about Diane Whitfield somewhere 2 states away, probably still awake herself, wondering why her son's credit card had suddenly stopped working at a gas station, wondering why her carefully timed paperwork scheme had blown up in her hands because she'd chosen my kitchen table, on my watch, to try and pull it off. Craig showed up at my door at 9 that morning. I watched him from the front window before I answered, watched him reach for his key, the spare I'd given him years ago for emergencies, watched him try it in a lock that no longer recognized it, because I'd had the locksmith out at 7:30. He stood on my porch for a long moment, just looking at that door like it might change its mind if he waited long enough. Then he knocked. I let him knock twice before I opened it. "Robert," he started, and I held up one hand, and he stopped, the way people stop when some part of them already knows they've lost the argument before it starts. "Your mother nearly let my grandson stop breathing in my den," I said, "over a lake house that was never going to be your wife's to begin with. You knew he wasn't feeling well. You knew, because your wife checked on him twice and came back to that table both times, and you let her because you wanted to be in the room when the money got decided. I don't know who taught you that priorities work that way. It wasn't me, and it certainly wasn't your father-in-law giving you his trust for 6 years." He didn't say anything. His jaw was doing that thing jaws do when a man is trying very hard not to cry in front of his father-in-law. "I love my daughter," I said. "I will love my grandchildren until the day I die, and nothing that happened yesterday changes $1 of what's set aside for them, because that money was never about you. But every door I opened for you, every favor, every dollar that made your life easier so you'd have room to be a good husband and a good father, that's finished. Not because I'm cruel, because you showed me yesterday exactly what you do with room to breathe when nobody's watching." "For how long?" he asked quietly, and it was the first honest thing he'd said to me in 4 years. "Until you're the kind of man who checks on his son before he checks on a signature," I said. I didn't invite him in. I watched him walk back to his car, sit there for a full minute without starting it, and then finally drive away. Melissa called me that afternoon, and this conversation was different, because she is still my daughter, and I am still her father, and nothing about that changes. Not ever. She was crying before I even said hello, and I let her cry, because some things a person has to get through before they can hear you. I keep seeing his face, she said. Gray. I keep seeing it. Good, I told her, gently as I could manage. Let it stay there a while. It'll make you a better mother than fear ever could. We talked for a long time that afternoon, longer than we'd talked, just the two of us, in years. I didn't yell at her the way I might have yelled at Craig, because grief and shame were already doing that work for me, and a father doesn't need to pile on top of what a mother's already carrying about her own child. But I told her plainly that Diane Whitfield would never again be alone in a room with my grandchildren if I had anything to say about it, and that if she and Craig wanted to keep chasing money that was never really theirs to chase, they were welcome to do it without my name attached to any part of it. She didn't argue with me. I think some part of her had been waiting a long time for somebody to finally close a door. She didn't have the strength to close herself. Some of you listening to this are going to say I was too hard on my own daughter, too hard on a son-in-law who made one terrible decision on one terrible afternoon. Maybe you're right. But I watched a doctor, a stranger who had never met my grandson before that night, recognize an emergency faster than the people sitting 20 feet away from him, and I decided somewhere in that hospital hallway that the kindest thing I had left to offer my family wasn't more comfort. It was consequences. Real ones, the kind that teach a lesson instead of just postponing it. Tyler came home from the hospital with a new inhaler, a follow-up appointment, and a spring in his step by Sunday that told me kids bounce back faster than the rest of us ever do. He doesn't know what his grandfather did that night while he slept off the worst scare of his short life. He probably never will. Not the details, not the phone calls, not the locksmith. All he knows is that his grandfather came home early and picked him up and drove him somewhere safe as fast as the car would go. That's the only part of this story that matters to me now. He's breathing. He's laughing again, loud, at the swing set, the way 7-year-olds are supposed to laugh. Everything else, every dollar, every door I closed, every relationship I let cool off, that was just the cost of making sure it stays that way. If this one hit you somewhere, do me a favor and hit that like button before you go. And if you've got a family story of your own where somebody finally had to draw a line, I want to hear it. So leave it down in the comments. Thanks for spending this time with me tonight. I'll see you on the next one.